Well, we've come to the showdown. First 7 chapters, reconciliation with those that still like Paul, that have reconciled to him, covering, just trying to tie up some loose ends. Chapter 8 and 9, looking at the taking up the offering again, getting all that started again, talking to people who are still on Paul's side. So 9 chapters are done, and obviously, hopefully, the church has come back on side. But there is still a very, very, very big elephant in the room. Probably a couple of them, in fact. And they are the false apostles. Because at some point, whoever was against Paul have gone and brought in their own apostles. They've brought in some replacements. Now, imagine if you're a pastor and you go away on a holiday, take some long service leave, and you come back and there's like a new pastor. And no, we replaced you. Yeah, you're terrible. So we brought some new guys in, and they are just awesome. In fact, they actually call themselves super apostles, hupeia apostle. I don't know what that meant, whether they had their underwear outside their togas or wore capes, who knows. But they weren't just apostles, they were hyper apostles. They were super apostles. Paul says, oh really? Well, actually, they're false apostles. But let me show you why. So, they're in the room. There's probably a couple of Corinthians, clearly the ones that have brought them in, who are there with them, listening along. Paul, yep, okay, right, typical Paul, trying to abuse us, blah, blah, blah. Now Paul turns his attention towards these guys. But see what I'm doing here? I'm pointing there, but I'm looking at you, because that's what Paul's doing. He never, ever addresses them. He talks about them, he talks around them, but he never talks to them, because that's the way that you really offend somebody. You don't even give them the dignity of your focus. So all of these chapters that have come is Paul comparing himself, or they've compared themselves to Paul, now Paul's comparing himself back to them to show why he is a true apostle, which he's kind of shown anyway, but now he really needs to drive home the point. But more importantly, why they actually are it's not that they're not apostles, it's not that they're not super apostles, it's not that they're average apostles, they are not apostles. And this is the point that Paul needs to make this. Let's pick it up from chapter 10, verse 1. Paul says, I, Paul, myself. All right, so somebody's reading this letter out, and it would be very easy for to start to lose sight of the fact that it's Paul behind this letter. And so by doing this, whoever it is reading it out is reading those words out. Probably Titus is reading those words out, but it's that reminder, oh, that's right, it's Paul saying this. This is Titus reading on behalf of Paul, but really it's Paul the one that's saying it. So I, Paul, myself, entreat you, by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold towards you when away, I beg of you that when I am present, I may not have to show boldness with such confidence as I count on showing against some who suspect us of walking according to the flesh. I, Paul, who am humble when face to face, and that's a disparaging term. I'm meek, I'm useless, I'm just a wet blanket, I'm hopeless when I'm face to face, but I'm big and tough when I'm away from you. Now that's the sort of the double standard that they're accusing Paul of being. Paul says, look, I wasn't asked in that letter. You don't want to see that face to face. You think because you haven't seen it so far it doesn't exist. Trust me, it exists. You just don't want to see it. I'm kind of sparing you of that, and I'd like to spare you of that if I can. Because remember, he's not talking to the apostles here. He's talking to the people who are following them. He's trying to win them back from loyalty to those false apostles. For though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this verse, but it's one you're familiar with probably from some sort of spiritual warfare. We use this to talk about praying against principalities and powers and strongholds and all these sort of things. It's not really what Paul's talking about. There's no context for it here. What Paul is talking about, what he's talking about tearing down, are the arguments that are set up, the false doctrines that are set up that actually bind the Christians away from God. Because at the end of the day, bad theology isn't just, there could be better theology, at least it's theology. No. Bad theology actually can hold you away from God. It can keep you separated from God. These guys represent bad theology. It's not just a matter of coming in and correcting or tweaking their ideas. It's about tearing down their arguments. It's tearing down their wrong ideas. And that's what he has to do. It's not even a case of coming in and saying, we could work with them. No. We need to tear this whole thing down. All their teachings, all of your beliefs about them that somehow being more eloquent makes you a better apostle. These ideas have bound you, and they've not just kept you away from me, Paul, they've actually kept you away from Christ. And that's the bigger concern. And so our job as apostles is to tear those things apart, to free you so that you can come into full access of Jesus Christ. And that's the task that we've set for ourselves, and that's exactly what we're about to do. So join me in the next video and we'll see how Paul does it. So the first piece of evidence that Paul is an apostle, because that's the issue these super apostles have raised, is whether or not Paul is even an apostle. So Paul says, you want proof that I'm an apostle? Well, I've already given it to you in chapter 3, but let's just reiterate the point. Look at what's right in front of your eyes. If anyone is confident that he is Christ's, let him remind himself that just as he is Christ, so also are we. So it's a simple question. How did you come to be a Christian? You preach, Paul. Right. And when you committed your life to Christ, under whose ministry was that? You, Paul. Right. And so you consider yourself a Christian? Yeah. So then if you're a Christian under my ministry, would that not suggest that I'm a minister of Christ? Yeah, we see where you're going with this, Paul. I'm glad you do. Because it's kind of obvious, proof's in the pudding. If I'm not an apostle, you're not a Christian. That's a problem. So if you're a Christian, you're welcome. Not that I need the praise for it, but it at the very least endorses my ministry. For even though I do boast a little too much of our authority, which of course he doesn't, but that's what they've assumed, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for destroying you, I will not be ashamed. It's kind of like this. Imagine your little kid wants to drink poison. And you go, no, don't be silly. It's just ridiculous. Oh, you're so terrible. You're a terrible parent. You're just abusing your authority and, you're so bad. And you go, okay, fine, granted. I'm a terrible parent because I won't let you eat poison. I won't let you drink poison. Shame on me. But it's to build you up and not to watch you die in front of me. So yeah, I'm sorry if I did come across a little bit strong. I'm sorry that I cared about you so much that I was just maybe a little bit abrasive in the way that I, disciplined you so that you would not go to hell. Forgive me. I do not want to appear to be frightening you with my letters, for they say, guys in the corner, they say, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech of no account. Literally, this speech is of no account is his speech moves us to contempt. It's not just that he's a bad preacher. When he gets up, I just kind of cringe. Like, it's just that bad. It's just, oh my goodness, do I have to suffer through this? Fine, I'll grant you that. And my letters are weighty and strong. Let such a person understand, again, this is nice use of periphrasis, let such a person understand that what we say by letter when absent, we do when present. You haven't seen it yet because I'd rather not have to go there. But if I have to, I will. But let's just see if we can avoid that scenario. Not that this would have ever happened in Corinth, but do you remember when Paul got really fired up in Galatia. There was a first missionary journey. He's there. I can't remember the name of the island, but you've got the governor Sergius Paulus, and you've got this other guy Bar Jesus, who's contradicting Paul's message, who's just constantly challenging him. And so he fires up and he says, "You are a son of the devil," and really just lets go. The dude went blind. Just think about that for a second. He went blind. So when Paul fires up, people go blind. The demon girl in Philippi, he fired up. Demon left, like, fled. Paul's like, you don't want to go there. There's kind of like this power that works through me. It's kind of, I can't necessarily control it, but sometimes when I walk past people, my shadow actually raises them up from their sick beds. And, you know, I've touched handkerchiefs in the past, and they've been taken to the sick, and the sick have been healed. I didn't ask for this power of God to work in me, but when I fire up, it's kind of like Hulk. You don't want to see me when I'm angry. Things happen, crazy things happen. So let's just try to keep everything constrained, okay? Cool? All right, so I'll go back to being Bruce Banner. Okay. Not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves. Again, our friends in the corner. But when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they're without understanding. You know those letters of recommendation, they probably wrote them for each other. You get that, right? You know, the only good things you've heard about them are what they're saying about each other. You know, it's kind of like three people just, you know, oh, this guy's awesome. No, he's more awesome than I am. No, he's even more awesome. And everyone, oh, they're so awesome. And everyone's like, you know, you're three douchebags. Like, there's nothing good about any of you. In your opinion, you're awesome, but you all kind of suck. Paul's like, that just proves it. If all they're doing is endorsing each other, they're without understanding. They're just a bunch of idiots. But we will not boast beyond limits, but will boast only with regard to the area of influence God assigned to us, to reach even to you. For we are not overextending ourselves, as though we did not reach you. For we were the first to come all the way to you with the gospel of Christ. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. A lot of you ministers will know what I mean when I say this. You've been working with in a ministry for years and years and years, or maybe in a church or in a youth group for years and years, and you've been saying the same thing week in, week out, ad nauseum. It's just, you're thinking, my goodness, this is driving me crazy. And then you get a guest preacher comes in, and they preach exactly the same thing, and all of a sudden, everybody responds. And it's like, oh my goodness, why hasn't anybody ever preached this before? My goodness, Pastor, what have you've been holding back from us? I've been saying the same thing for years, and only now you listen? It's kind of like that. But then imagine then if that pastor, whoever that preacher was, went around from then on saying, you should have seen the results that I had in that particular church. Oh my goodness, I am so awesome. I was like, I planted, I did all the basic work, I laid the foundation, I was the one sending letters, I was the one building you up, and then these guys come along and they preach one sermon and suddenly they're like, Jesus has come back? All right, look, if that's what they're going to boast about, that's fine, but I'm just going to say, I'll never do that. I'm not going to come into somebody else's ministry, do one thing, and take all the credit for it. I'd rather go and do something new. I'd rather go and do the groundwork and spend the years and put the time in and pay the dues. That's kind of how I'm going to approach my ministry. You guys are fine if you want to take credit for my work. You're welcome. But I'll never do that, because it's kind of what stupid people do. We do not boast beyond limit in the labours of others, but our hope, I love that, just let us see for a minute. We will not boast beyond limit in the labours of others. That's all they're doing. But our hope is that as your faith increases, our area of influence amongst you may be greatly enlarged, so that we may preach the gospel in lands beyond you, without boasting of work already done in another's area of influence. Let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Remember, we said that all the way back in 1 Corinthians. This is a good catch verse for Paul. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. Ouch. These guys are just talking themselves up. They're just commending themselves. Paul says that's all good and well, but that's not anything. The only one that matters is the one the Lord commends. So really the question comes down to, which is the one that the Lord commends here? Well, so far it's been me. So, what are you going to do with that? Anyway, we'll find out in the next video. So the question might be asked, why did these guys get a hearing in the first place? These false apostles, if they're so bad as Paul's describing them, how did they get a foot in the door in the first place? Well, the answer's pretty simple. They had a lot of boasting about each other and about all these great achievements that they've seen in their ministry. It really is kind of like, if every time a miracle happened in ministry or, a great altar call, you literally put it down on your CV in bullet points of all of these great things that I've done. It's not wrong. If you're doing that, it's not wrong. It doesn't really say much, But for these false apostles, that was it. That was their CV, was who they were. And so they could list off all of these great things that they've done. And then they asked the question of the Corinthians, so what did Paul do? What was so great about Paul? Oh, he did a few things while he was here, but surely there's more to it than that. Well, we don't really know. He didn't really say much about his ministry. He didn't really boast much. But clearly, these false apostles have something impressive going for them. It's obviously enough to get the Corinthians interested. And so in response, they're saying, effectively what they've said to Paul is, look, we've got super apostles, right? I mean, okay, you've started to undermine them, sure, but they're super apostles, right? These guys wear capes. I mean, these guys are pretty awesome. What's so good about you, Paul? You never really boasted much. You never really bragged. Now we go, oh, well, it's because, that's what humble people should do. Well, this is a world where boasting is expected. If you're a great person, it's expected that you boast. That's just how you gain status. Paul never did that. And so they're kind of like, well, what is it that's so great about you? If you really are an apostle, then you must have some pretty good stories to tell. You must have some great miracles to tell. So let's hear it, Paul. I mean, basically what they're saying is we want to compare CVs. We've got super apostles. You must be a super duper apostle if you're going to be better than these guys. So what's your CV? Now, Paul knows this. Paul knows that this is what they want. They want him to boast. They want him to sing his own praises and tell them how fantastic he is. He doesn't want a bar of it, but he's realizing, he does realize that he's going to have to do something. He's going to have to respond somehow to this request to see how fantastic he is. But he doesn't want to do it. It's just that thing you just don't want to even get out of bed to do. Paul's kind of at that. So he's trying to just procrastinate as much as possible. This is in verse 11, chapter 11, verse 1. I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness, talking about this boasting. Do bear with me, for I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband, to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I am afraid that, as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from sincere and pure devotion to Christ. Who's the serpent here? Well, obviously it's these guys. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one you proclaimed, than one we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it readily enough. Paul's saying, look, I hope you're going to put up with me in a little bit of foolishness, but apparently that's the only way you hear things, because you kind of fools yourself. You don't really know the gospel. That's why you put up with any gospel that you hear. So I guess I'm going to have to be a fool in order to get my point across, or for you to even be able to hear me. It kind of takes one to know one, in a way. Indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these, quote, super apostles, even if I am unskilled in speaking. I am not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way we have made this plain to you in all things. Paul says, I consider that I'm not in the least inferior to these apostles. No, you're going to make a point of that a bit later on. Actually, it says here, even if I'm unskilled in speaking, the word he uses here is the word idiotes, where we get our word idiot from. And it literally means uneducated. Paul says, when it comes to speaking, yeah, I'll admit it, I'm an idiot. Fine, you got me there. But you have to at least acknowledge that I have some knowledge. I've shown you that. I've proven that. So, knowledge and speech, they're the two main things that you have to be elite. I've at least got it going with the knowledge side. I'll grant you on the speech, though, well, not really, but just we'll make that point. Sure, in that way, I'm inferior to these super apostles. But what's the real crux of the issue? It's right here in verse 7. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted? Because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge. Because really that's the issue. I didn't take your money. And you've actually taken that to be a sin. Or that somehow because I've offended you, it's in some way a sin. Is that what you mean by it? Was it a sin that I didn't want to take your money? Is that what we've got to? I mean, really, you've gone to these guys because of my sin, I've not taken your money. Come on. He goes on, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them. I like that. I robbed them, that's basically what it comes down to. I robbed them in order to serve you. And when I was with you in need, I did not burden anyone. For the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my needs. So remember, this is where Timothy and Silas came from Macedonia. They supplied Paul's need. Right? That's where this whole thing went wrong. And that's why right at the end of 2 Corinthians, we're still talking about something that happened 5 years ago. Because that was the starting point of the downfall of that relationship. So I refrained, and I will refrain from burdening you in any way. It's not even about my right to demand from you. I will not be a burden to you. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do. I mean, that's what we've got to. You didn't take our money, so you mustn't like us very much. You must like the Macedonians more than us. You really think that's what this is? It's because I loved you that I didn't take your money. It's because I loved you that I didn't abuse you and steal from you. I stole from other people so they wouldn't have to steal from you. But apparently that's a sin. And for that, I'm so terribly sorry. And what I'm doing, I will continue to do in order to undermine the claim of those who would like to claim, again, these are the guys in the corner, would like to claim that in their boasted mission, they work on the same terms as we do. Oh, that's harsh. That's harsh. These people over there think they're like us. They got nothing on us. For such men, for such men are false apostles, right? They're not super apostles. They're not even apostles. They're false apostles. Deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. Wow. Now, Paul said a moment ago, I'm not the least inferior to these super apostles. Thank God, because they're servants of Satan. Right? I mean, he'd have to be pretty bad to be less than a servant of Satan. And they're in the room. They're in the room. Wow. Wow. Okay, he's not holding back here. This is just, someone's about to go blind, kind of, Paul. It's heating up. So, well, there's plenty more to come, so join me in the next video. So Paul realizes that the only way he's going to win back this small group who are following these false apostles is to give them what they want. It's to just give him his CV, to tell them all these great reasons why he's so fantastic and why he's better than these super apostles. If that's what they need, then that's what he's just going to have to do. But he wants to be very careful for them to realize that this is just about as stupid and as dumb and as ungodly as you could possibly imagine. And so he spends even more time procrastinating before he gets to the point as to how stupid this actually is. He says, I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may do a little boasting. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Think about that for a moment. What I'm about to do is not the word of the Lord. This is the word of a fool. Right, so right now, guys, just so you realize, before we get into this, Holy Spirit just left the room. He's not with us anymore. This is just us now. God wants no part of this. This is not the word of the Lord. This is me being an idiot. But apparently, it takes one to know one. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast, for you gladly bear with fools, being so wise yourself. So, all right. You need me to be a fool? Apparently, that's the only way I can speak to a fool. Okay, let's get it. I just can't do it. He goes on, for you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. One of the things about this patron-client relationship that I've alluded to is that you would have your patron who would be supporting the client, and there's the client's responsibility to come and give honor to the patron. Now, in a world before social services, you can very easily see how this practice might get abused. You could be a person that says, well, why do I need to bother working when I can just go and find myself a patron? What do they need from me? I'll go there every morning, I'll stand on their doorstep, I'll give them a high five, tell them how fantastic they are, maybe follow them around through the day. I've got nothing else to do anyway, I'm not working. If that's what they want from me, that's fine. If it means I don't have to go out and dig a hole or, plow a field, then perfect. Sign me up. So what used to happen was that in these patron-client relationships, you get people that would abuse them. They were called parasites. And that's how they were known. In other words, you're talking about kind of the first century doll bludger. And so the way that they're described is exactly the terms that Paul uses here. They devour you. They take advantage of you. They put on airs. That is, they strike a pose there. Oh, you're so fantastic. Oh, my goodness, you are just like God himself. You are so, oh, wow. Just talking the whole thing up. Putting on airs. But really what they're doing is just striking you in the face. They're just abusing you. Put it back in the context of Corinthians, because what's happened is that these false apostles have come into Corinth, and where Paul hasn't taken support, they have. Now, for Paul to take support is legitimate. He is a legitimate apostle. But if a false apostle comes along to a Christian congregation to take money from them, to take financial support from them, what that person is a parasite. They're an abuser. And even if that's not so obvious, it's going to be obvious now, the way that Paul is describing them. So what he says about these people, this is talking about them. He says, you will so easily put up with someone who makes a slave of you. They've enslaved you to their desires. They're devouring from you. They're going into your pantry and they're raiding it for their own pleasure. They're taking advantage of you. They're talking a big game, but really, they're just striking you in the face. Paul says, to my shame, I'm so sorry, we were too weak for that. Because clearly a sign of a really strong minister is somebody that can abuse their people. That's real strength. That's real bravado. Paul says, obviously we must be weak because we didn't come in there and abuse you. I'm so sorry. I'm so unbelievably sorry. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I'm speaking as a fool. Let's be clear about this. I'm speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? Are they Christians? I'm a better one. Okay. What's the deal with being Hebrew, being Jewish? Well, of course, you are of Abraham, right? I mean, and it wasn't just about being able to say, oh, I'm Jewish, but you need to be able to trace your descendancy back to Abraham because he's the father of the Jewish nation. And so you are full-blooded Jew if you are from the son of a child of Abraham. But the only tribes, so there was the 12 tribes of Israel, they all went into exile. Only 2 of them came back, and that was the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, or Paul. Saul, the king is named after the king who was a Benjamite, Saul. Paul could say, I'm a Benjamite, which means that he can literally trace his bloodline back to Abraham. So Paul says, if we're talking about Jewishness, look, I've got the circumcision to prove it, but more than that, I've got the bloodline to prove it. I'm as Jewish as they come. But that's not important. What's important is, are they Christians? Are they servants of Christ? Paul says, I'm a better one. And you go, wow, that's arrogant. Really, Paul? You're going to tell him that you're a better Christian than these other guys? Yeah. But to be fair, they're servants of Satan. I mean, you could try, I don't think it's going to work, to be a servant of Satan and a servant of Christ. I just don't see how that would work. So if you're going to serve Satan, you can't at the same time serve Christ. So if these guys are actually serving Satan, that would say at the same time, they're not Christians. So to Paul to say, I'm a better servant of Christ than they are, well, that's pretty easy because they don't even serve Christ at all. They're not even Christian, right? So if I was to say, I'm a better Christian than my atheist neighbour, that's not me boasting, that's just stating a fact, because I'm a Christian at all. I may not be a very good Christian, but I'm still a better one than one that's not even a Christian to begin with. But for the Corinthians, this is gold. This is like, oh, finally, Paul's about to give us what we want to hear. I mean, he's about to come out and say he's a better Christian. Now, we go, oh my goodness, you're so arrogant. The Corinthians are going, yes, finally. What makes you so good, Paul? You're a better Christian than these guys? Okay, fine, we'll grant you that. Tell us why, Paul. What are your reasons? We'll come back in the next video and we'll see why. So Paul's now got them on the edge of their seats. They're finally, the big moment's arrived when Paul's going to explain all of these great things that he's done, all of these fantastic ministries that he's been part of, and the miracles and all the rest of it. Finally, Paul is going to list for them what makes him a super duper apostle as compared to these just plain old super apostles. And he says, all right, here it goes. Before we get there, just let's be clear, I am talking like a madman. Not even a fool anymore. This is insane. This is completely insane. With far greater labours, far more imprisonments, what? With countless beatings and often near death. Where are you going with this, Paul? 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. Now, you might have heard it preached before, maybe you've preached it yourself, that why you only got 39 lashes, 40 minus 1, is because if you flog a person more than 40 times, they're going to die. Maybe you've heard that before. Every time I've preached this, I've asked the question of the audience, and always at least somebody says, oh yeah, we've heard that before. My 6-year-old would be able to figure out that it's kind of a dumb thing to say. I've got friends that are big people, like big muscly guys. If I flogged that guy 40 times, he'd just take it as a good back massage. If you flogged me 40 times, I'd be dead 3 times over. Basic physiology would suggest that the number of times you flog somebody is completely irrelevant. There's no set number. It's because it's kind of suddenly like your body's going, oh, wait, we're at 39, one more I'm going to die, and then 40, boom, you're dead. Come on. Just, it's a bit silly. Why you only got 40 minus 1 comes back to Deuteronomy 25:2. What this punishment is talking about, this is the synagogue punishment. So in the synagogue, they have the authority, the right to minister their own punishment, to deal with people within their community. So we've talked a lot about this. In your community, it's about maintaining community discipline. And so the Jews did have the right within their community to discipline people who were what's the word I'm looking for? Just blasphemers, teaching false doctrine, that sort of thing. Reprobate, no, the word will come to me. When somebody is found to be guilty of the crime of blasphemy, they have a choice. They can be flogged, or they can be exiled, excommunicated from the community, from the synagogue, never welcome back into the synagogue. Now, the synagogue is the heartbeat, that is the location where the Jews in that community would meet. So to be excommunicated from the synagogue is a big deal. So the alternative then is to be flogged. Deuteronomy 25 says that if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offence. 40 stripes may be given to him, but not more, lest if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. It's got absolutely nothing to do with if it's going to kill a person. It's entirely to do with whether it's going to shame a person. There's discipline, and then there's just shame in the person. And so what the Jews would do in the synagogue is they would determine the level of the crime, the level of the offence, which would then first determine the type of punishment. And if it's been deemed that the person deserves to be flogged, it's then up to the person who's actually doing the flogging to determine the number of stripes based on actually the physical size of the person. So if you're a small person, you would expect to get less lashes because they recognise that you're a smaller body and you may not survive that many lashes. Now, this is different to the Romans. Most of the time when the Romans flogged a person, they would die because of the types of whips they used, and they were terrible. But for the Jews, they still had a very strong respect for the dignity of the people within their community. They wanted to discipline you, but they didn't want to humiliate you or to potentially kill you. That was the last thing they wanted to do. And so they would then determine, based on your size, how serious the flogging would be. So the fact that on 5 different occasions, Paul was given the 40 lashes minus 1, which is the maximum punishment, would actually suggest to us that he was quite a large guy. Be it muscly or maybe a bit overweight, I don't know. But he was obviously, they deemed him big enough to be able to receive the full 40 lashes, or 40 minus 1. But there's something more profound at work here. Paul says on 5 different occasions, he was given the option. Having preached Jesus, he would be then given he'd been charged, given the option of take the flogging or be excommunicated. On 5 different occasions, he took the flogging. Conversely, had he taken the excommunication, he wouldn't be welcomed back at the synagogue the next Saturday. So how could he come back and preach Jesus if he's excommunicated? So it would be better for the mission to take the flogging than it would be to take the excommunication. Now, once you've been flogged, it might take a couple of weeks before you can come back after that sort of flogging. Because the whip they used to use, they'd get a long leather lash and they'd double it over so you'd have sort of 2 big cords, and that's what they used to flog you with. And so it would have been quite damaging. But here's my question. We've realised that Paul's a human. He wasn't some angelic being. You flog a person 40 times on 5 different occasions, what does that do to your back? How much scar tissue does that leave? What does that do to your posture? That you've been flogged 40 times, from everything from the buttocks right up to the back of the neck. The physical scarring on the back of Paul, just from this Jewish punishment, what would that have looked like? And that wasn't all. He goes on, he says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. This is the Roman punishment. And we read about one of these in Acts chapter 16. It says he was beaten so severely, and then they threw him in stocks, that the next day the Roman who was converted had to actually help to heal his wounds. The Romans didn't have any qualms about how many times they hit you. They just beat you until their arms were tired. Now, the person that did this, every governor in every city would have been accompanied by what was called a lictor, who was the disciplinarian. And what they had was a bundle of rods with an axe, and they would carry that around as a sign of their authority. In fact, this bundle was called a fasces, which is where we get the word fascism from. It's authoritarian rule. What these were was a symbol of authority, but if need be, if you were found guilty, you were brought up on trial, you were found guilty, you'll be flogged then on the spot. There was no jail system. It wasn't like you got 3 years or 5 years or whatever. Jails were only used until you were to be brought up on trial for whatever crime. But if they could punish you then on the spot, that's what they would do. Now here's the thing. Paul's a Roman citizen. You're not allowed to flog a Roman citizen. Remember what happened in Philippi? He gets flogged. The next day they come to say, hey, no, it's cool to go home. He says, hang on a second, I'm a Roman citizen. And they freak out because they flogged a Roman citizen, because you're not allowed to flog a Roman citizen. So on 3 different occasions, Paul, with his back faced to a Roman governor or to a Roman authority, accepted the flogging rather than say these simple words, I am a Roman citizen. Because those 4 words would have got him out of that punishment. But he didn't do it. Why? Well, because it's very hard for Paul, in a Roman city like Corinth or Philippi, to say to the poor, to those that are not citizens, who don't have that right, oh, I can get out of being persecuted, but you can't, so sorry. How can you relate to a person if you're not willing to go through the same thing that they're going to go through? So on 3 different occasions, Paul was flogged by the Romans, on top of scar tissue from the 200 lashes that he's already received from the Jews. What's that going to do to your back? I mean, surely that's got to hurt getting up in a cold morning, at the very least, if it hasn't twisted your posture somewhat. But that's not the end of the story. Not by a long shot. It says, once I was stoned. Now, this isn't Paul in the 60s going through his experimental phase. This is, they threw rocks at his head until he was going to die. They wanted him dead. And we read about this actually in Acts 14. It talks about this when he was there in Lystra. When they used to stone a person, what the Jews used to do was they'd take you up into a high platform and they'd throw you off. Not like a cliff, but maybe a high roof or something. They'll throw you off with the idea being that the fall should kill you. Maybe it'll break your neck or whatever it is. But in the event that it doesn't kill you, somebody would come along with a big rock and they'd drop it on your head. And if that didn't work, on your chest. That's right, they'd drop it on your chest. If that didn't work, if that didn't kill you, then they pelt you with rocks. So you remember the time when Jesus is in the synagogue? He's pretty sure it's back in Nazareth, but whatever. He was in the synagogue and they got really fired up. Because he was saying that he was the fulfillment of Isaiah. And so they took him up to a high place and they were about to throw him off. What were they going to do? They were going to stone him. And we're talking about some Echo Point type cliff that, 15-minute fall sort of thing. Where he was actually very flat. So we might have been talking about something the height of, a couple of story building. But the idea was they were going to throw him off as a part of the process of stoning him. So Paul has been stoned. Somewhere in Lystra, they've taken him up onto a high place, they've thrown him off, they've dropped a rock on him in case he hasn't been killed then, and then probably pelted him with rocks, and they've left him for dead. Or left him assuming he was dead. Why did they assume he was dead? Because he was dead. Like, you don't get rocks pelted at your head and survive to tell the story. You actually die. But then these crazy Christians got around and prayed for him, and he came back to life. And I can imagine how frustrated he would have been with them, because finally he's going into his glory, and then they pray and he's coming back and he's like, oh crap, now I'm going to get more of this sort of stuff. Thanks, guys. I'm sure it wasn't like that. But getting rocks pelted at your head, rocks big enough, am I talking little pebbles, right? It's not like throwing gravel at him. We're talking rocks that are big enough to do some damage. What's that going to do to your head? Brain damage, perhaps? Paul says to the Galatians, I bear the marks of Christ on my body. That wasn't a metaphor. He says, you want proof? Here, look at my back. Look at my head. Look at the scars. I bear the physical marks of Christ on my body because this is the cost that I've paid for this calling that God has called me towards. Oh, I'm sorry, Corinthians, you wanted these great stories. Well, this is all I got. It's just a life of suffering. But this is why I know that I really am a servant of Christ. But he doesn't stop there. There's plenty more of this to come. So join me in the next video. Well, Paul's only just got started. That's just the floggings and the stoning. Let's be honest, right? If any of us in sort of a Western church, in quite very privileged circumstances, was ever flogged for the gospel, even once, quite seriously, we would be on the preaching circuit. We would be writing the book about the time we got flogged for Jesus and the trauma that we experienced. We'd be on the preaching circuit. We'd be going around telling our story everywhere, showing the scars. Look at what they did for me in the name of Christ. And it would just be a pivotal moment in our lives. Paul gets flogged, and it's like, oh, it's Tuesday. Oh, flip, that week went quickly. This is just part of life for him. He goes on, he says, 3 times I was shipwrecked. So 3 times he reenacts the last scene of Titanic, right? He's out there in the Mediterranean, and he's just floating around a piece of board. Now, seriously, you shipwrecked once, you're saying, God, this is crap, this is ridiculous. You shipwrecked twice, you're saying, all right, now it's just getting stupid. You shipwrecked 3 times, you're saying, God, are you kidding? Are you unoriginal? Is there anything else we could try? Come on, we've done the shipwreck thing. What else have you got for me? Oh, a night and a day I was adrift at sea. Out in the Mediterranean. Don't know if anyone's going to come and pick you up. Obviously somebody did. But a night and a day out in the sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers like these idiots over here. In toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. It's just been a life on the run. It's just one bad experience after the other. We go, forget this Christianity thing. Paul says, I know I'm on track. I know I'm still on course because this is what's happening to me. Because my life seems to be lived in accord with the same sufferings that Christ himself experienced. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Another thing that really bothered Paul the most, the thing that really weighed him down the most, you think, okay, in just even in modern psychological understanding, you get flogged once, that's going to maybe do some psychological damage. You get flogged 5 times by the Jews, 3 times by the Romans, and you're stoned to death. That's got to take a psychological toll. Then spending a life on the run, continually in fear, not waking up every morning convinced that today's the day. And if you get to the end of the day, you've done well. That's got to take a psychological toll. And yet the thing that actually crushed Paul was his children in Corinth doing what they've just done. Forget the beatings. That's just part of life. That's just the Roman Empire at best. It's just being a Christian at worst. That's whatever. You just take that in your stride. He says the thing that really kills me, the thing that really weighs on my soul most heavily, beyond all of the beatings and everything else, is my concern for the churches. Because when something goes wrong in one of those churches in the ancient world, there's no internet. You can't pick up a phone and say, guys, put that idiot on the phone, let's deal with this. It's a letter, which takes months. And you don't know what's happening. You don't know if it's going to work. And then it's more months before you get a response. Maybe it's 6 months. You don't know what's going to happen in that 6 months. And so for Paul, the only thing he has at his disposal is prayer. That's all he's got. Besides all the floggings, besides everything else. That just astounds me. Everything Paul's experienced for this last 12 months, that's the thing that weighs on his soul. That's the thing that almost crushes him. It's not the physical abuse. It's the spiritual devastation. And he says, who is weak? And I'm not weak. Who is made to fail? made to fall, and I'm not indignant. He says, you think I don't get tempted? You don't think Satan's coming after me every single day? Here's the thing with the enemy. He doesn't need to take out 100 people if he can take out the leader. He doesn't need to take out some pleb somewhere. He just needs to take out the head, and everything else will crumble. He knows that. So you think about the early church, you think about everything that Paul has done, because here we are still 2,000 years later talking about the guy. Do you not think that he was prime target number one of the enemy? Do you not think he probably mustered an army to try to take Paul down? I mean, if we're talking spiritual terms, Paul is primary target. He's who you need to take down. And we've seen this, right? You've seen this happen. You've seen some great minister who's climbed and the pinnacle of ministry and, international fame, and then they fall. And what happens? The ripples of devastation just continue on internationally. It kind of serves as a warning not to aspire to that position unless you're ready for that sort of attack. Because that's who the enemy's coming after. So Paul says, you don't think I've got the enemy on my tail? Like every day? At a purely practical level, Paul's a single man. He's a single man, a single male human being. Single, no longer married, maybe widowed, maybe divorced. You don't think he had any temptation? Paul has seen people raised from the dead. You don't think just for a moment he might think, hey, maybe I could get some credit for myself. Hey, Jesus, maybe do you want to share some of that credit? Maybe you want to say, praise Paul. You don't think for a minute in his weakest moments he might have just had some temptation towards a little bit of pride? Because that's all it would have taken to unravel him. And you don't think the enemy was at him on a constant basis. So for the floggings, fine. They just remind me that I'm alive. The thing that really gets me is when my church absolutely destroys my life and when the enemy comes after me on a daily basis. That's the real thing. That's the real killer. He says, if I'm going to boast, I'll boast about the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of Lord Jesus Christ, he who is blessed forever, knows that I'm not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. In the Roman army, one of the top prizes, one of the top military honors you could win was what was called the Corona Muralis. That is, it's the wall crown. It's the crown or the military award given to the general who manages to scale a wall and to take a city on the other side of the wall. Because if you've seen Lord of the Rings, you know that's difficult, right? I mean, the way those poor orcs were getting slaughtered trying to take the city, it's not easy, right? Not that I've ever tried it, but you can imagine trying to scale a wall and take it. It's going to be difficult. If you manage to do that, that deserves a great honor. So you're the general that scaled the wall. Paul kind of plays up that thing and he says, yeah, when I was in Damascus and it all hit the fan, I was the first guy down the wall. I kind of fled. So if you're looking for the great general, the great military leader of an apostle, I'm not him. Yeah, I was the first dude down the wall, so I can't even help you there. He says, if I must go on boasting, though there's nothing to be gained by it, I'll go into visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Right, so when Paul says here, I know a man, he's actually talking about himself. If you're going to boast, this is one of the ways you can do it. You can talk about somebody else, but everybody knows you're talking about yourself. So Paul says, that's right. He says, there was this one time where I went to heaven. And they're like, huh? They've been sitting through all this suffering. And Paul's like, oh, yeah, miracles, yeah. So there was this time I went and sat with Jesus and hung out with Jesus. We went to had a coffee. Great guy. You'll love him when you meet him. And they're like, oh, you've got to be kidding me, Paul. Like, you've been holding out on us. You're sure raising the dead, that's impressive, but you actually went to the third heaven. Yeah, Yeah, it was a pretty cool day. What happened? Can't tell you. What was said? Can't really tell you. Inexpressible words. You had to be there. But we weren't. Tell us. I'm sorry. If you weren't there, well, maybe you're just not so special. Maybe. Paul says, on behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast. Except in my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain from it, so that no one may think of me more than he sees in me or hears from me. Here's the thing. I could boast about all sorts of crazy stuff. I have seen miracles that would blow your mind. Right, you want to talk about a CV? Man, I've got a CV. It is impressive. And he says, you know what? It's not going to make any difference. It's not going to change anything. If you want me to out-compete these super apostles, I'll show you that I'm a super-duper apostle. It's not going to change anything. It's ultimately not going to fix this issue that's going on in your hearts. Because if everything I've done with you, if the integrity that I've shown in all these years is not enough for you, then nothing will be. If you need more, more's not going to help this. If the relationship that we have isn't enough for you, then nothing else is going to fix this. So I'm not going to bother with it. I'll allude to something, you know what? It's not going to change anything. If the scars on my back, the scars on my head aren't enough to prove that I'm a genuine apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, if your very salvation, the transformation that you've seen in your life and your community isn't enough proof that God is at work in me, then none of it's going to matter. So you know what? What you see is what you get. This is it. This is me. Take it or leave it. Well, there's one more thing he needs to say here. And let's just save this to the final video when we come to close this thing up. So with all that said, with all of the sufferings and everything that Paul's been through, he kind of lets slip a little bit. Maybe he kind of gets in the zone. Maybe he's sort of like, hey, maybe I will have a go at this boasting thing legitimately. Maybe I'll just kind of allude to some things, this great time that I had up in this third heaven. Maybe. But in the moment, I think that when Paul's writing this, probably all of these thoughts started to flood into his mind, all of these memories, all of these things that he's seen and done and experienced. And maybe just for a moment he reflects on that. And he realizes actually God was doing something pretty profound through all of that experience. In fact, the potential of all of those kinds of incredible miracles and experiences that he's been through, it could very easily lend a weaker person to become quite arrogant, quite boastful, much like these super apostles. And so he reflects on it and he says, you know, but God, even from the potential of my boasting, did something to redeem me. And remember, we talked a lot about suffering. Paul says, to prevent me from maybe going down too far with this, getting all up myself about it, he says, God did something for me. He says, to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. We don't like this verse, because this verse makes very clear that sometimes God will allow something to hinder us so that we would recognize that it's not by our strength. It's not by our strength. Paul says God allowed this thorn. He said, I was aware of it. He said 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. I didn't want it. But God knew that for this life, I needed it. And so he said to me this, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. For Paul, that was a revelation. For Paul, that was the defining moment, the characteristic of his ministry. He's already said to the Romans, rejoice in your suffering. This is what he says about this one. He says, therefore I'll boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses. I'll take pride in the sufferings. I'll rejoice in the sufferings. Because in doing so, the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. He says, guys, in summary, you want my CV? Here it is. There's only 2 things on it. Just 2. There's the abundance of my weakness, and there's the abundance of his grace. That's all I've got. Everything else is to the glory of God. There's no room for boasting. There's nothing else that can be said for that. And so for these Corinthians, he says, look, it's a case of take it or leave it. But if it's still about the money, well then let me say this to you. He says, first of all, I've become a fool. But you forced me to it. You actually pushed me into this corner. That I would even have to venture down this path of having to say this rubbish about myself. That I have to tell you this stuff that just doesn't need to be talked about. That you pushed me into it. He says, I would have been commended by you. For I was not inferior at all to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. Just a final jab at these super apostles. I am not inferior at all to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. So I'm better than the super apostles, and I'm nothing. So what does that make them? Well, less than nothing. They don't even have the dignity of being able to say that they're nothing. They're somewhere less than that. He says, you want proof? He says, well, just use your memories. The signs of a true apostle were performed amongst you with the utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. You saw enough to know. For in what were you less favoured than the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not burden you? Well, forgive me this wrong. For Paul, this is ministry. It's got nothing to do with him, and it's all to do with serving those that God has graced us with. And so for 5 years now, Paul has been in this rocky relationship with these Corinthians. And yet throughout all of it, has continued to serve, continued to lay down his rights, continued to lay down his life for the sake of them. Because he realizes that in this relationship, he's the father. He's the one that's called to sacrifice for them, not the other way around. And so he'll continue to serve and continue to serve. This was his last shot. But what's so fantastic about it is that it worked. It was stupid that it had to get this far. But the great thing is that it worked. Because we know that after this, he ended up in Corinth, from where he wrote Romans. And there's some suggestion, and it's another story for another day, but there's actually some suggestion that the house that he stayed in, well, we know that the house that he stayed in was the house of Gaius. He says that in Romans 16. But there's actually some suggestion that maybe it was actually Gaius who'd caused all this problem in the first place. So we have reconciliation to the point where not only has there been friendship reconnected, but that then Gaius would even come back to serve Paul. And so it's an incredible picture. If that's the case, and it's a very good argument to suggest that it is, this thing's come full circle, and just the power of reconciliation, the power of restoration, what Paul had been praying for and agonizing over for this last 12 months, it came back in spades. So it's an amazing story of ministry. And I hope that you've taken a lot out of this, but it's a beautiful set of letters. And I'd really encourage you just to go back through them now, read them in the light of the way that we've discussed them, and just let them permeate into your ministry, into your Christian life. Just get a sense of the heart of Paul, and just say, God, how do I replicate this into the people that you have given me the great and incredible gift of being able to look after? That would be my challenge to you from here on in. Thanks so much for being with me. Thank you so much for following me through to this point. I hope you've been blessed by it. I've certainly enjoyed even just talking to a camera. It's been fun just to talk through this material, but I really do hope it blesses you. God bless you, and I'll see you in another class. Until then.